The life of a shepherd in the Middle Ages was harsh and pitiless, even when the sun was caressing the meadows. But with the arrival of winter, it turned into a nightmare. The cold penetrated to the bones, hunger was a constant companion, and diseases like invisible predators lay in wait at every turn. Imagine a man cut off from civilization, surrounded by snow-covered expanses and endless darkness, where his only solace was the bleating of sheep, his charges, his only source of food and income. His existence was a constant battle with nature, with predators, with his own body which refused to obey in the bitter cold. In this world where survival was the ultimate value, shepherds developed gruesome and sometimes desperate methods to survive the winter. They were not just fighting for themselves, but also for their flocks, because the loss of sheep meant certain starvation. Today we will dive into this chilling world and reveal 10 scary facts about how English shepherds survived in the Middle Ages in winter, as well as look at their terrifying daily routine. Are you ready to learn about cannibalism out of desperation, the ghosts of hunger, and the price that the parish will pay for every day you live? Stay tuned and you will understand that the life of a medieval shepherd in winter was akin to endless torture. Pastoral life in ancient times in the Middle Ages was not a romantic idyll, but a harsh struggle for survival in conditions of constant threat, deprivation, and danger. Their existence was filled with unbearable difficulties that shaped not only the body, but also the spirit, tempering it or breaking it under incredible pressure. Shepherds often did not have permanent homes, and their nomadic or semi-nomadic life did not allow them to build capital houses. Instead, they built primitive dugouts, digging holes in the ground, or used natural caves and niches in the rocks that could somehow protect from the elements. These shelters were not just cramped and damp, they were real traps. Windswept, they let in icy air and moisture. But for the shepherd, it was at least some shelter from thessalite in the open frost. This dugout, hand-dug and covered with branches, tangled with turf and straw, was pitch black and palpable, and the air was suffocating with the smell of damp earth, rotten leaves, and the persistent, heavy spirit of animals that were often driven inside for warmth. The lack of ventilation turned the air into a heavy suspension, saturated with fumes and smoke, from which the head ached and the throat hurt. Any fire built inside for warmth filled the dugout with acrid smoke, causing coughing and lacrimation, and carbon monoxide was a constant threat that could kill a sleeping person without being noticed. In winter, the temperature inside these primitive shelters barely rose above freezing, and the humidity was such that any clothing, once wet, never dried completely, remaining constantly wet and icy. The mud or earthen walls were constantly leaking, letting in melting water and rain dampness, and the dirt floor was slimy and cold, crawling with insects, small rodents like mice, shrews, and sometimes larger pests like weasels and stoats, seeking warmth or food. These uninvited guests were, of course, a frequent, if disgusting, addition to the shepherd's meager diet when hunger became unbearable. The lack of basic hygiene and the constant presence of animals created ideal conditions for the spread of diseases. Parasites such as lice and fleas were ubiquitous, causing itching and skin infections. The constant, bone-chilling cold and ubiquitous dampness led to chronic illnesses, debilitating rheumatism, arthritis, agonizing colds that turned into deadly pneumonia, and frostbite of the limbs, which often resulted in tissue necrosis and amputation, rendering the shepherd crippled, unable to continue working or survive. Every night in such a dugout was a battle for warmth, and every breath was a breath of damp, musty air soaked with disease. When the shepherd woke up, he often found that his meager food supply had been chewed or spoiled, and at night Yemu was threatened not only by cold and hunger, but also by the possibility of being attacked by wild animals attracted by the smell of cattle. Unprotected entrances to dugouts could easily be overcome by wolves or bears, and it was not uncommon for shepherds to fall victim to such attacks. The only clothing that could provide any minimal protection from the bitter cold was raw animal skin obtained by the most primitive methods. Shepherds wrapped themselves in sheep, goat, or even wolf skins if they managed to get an animal or find its corpse. These skins, which had not undergone any proper treatment, neither tanning nor dressing quickly, became hard as bark, unbearably smelly, and, worst of all, infested with parasites. Lice, fleas, ticks. Unbearable itching was a constant companion of the shepherd, and the combed wounds often became infected, turning into festering ulcers and sometimes into deep, non-healing ulcers that could lead to sepsis. These skins were incredibly heavy, especially when wet from snow or rain, made it difficult to move quickly or perform work, and their disgusting, pungent smell of decaying livestock attracted wild animals, making the shepherd even more vulnerable. The constant humidity and lack of drying caused the skins to rot, exuding an acrid, unbearable stench that was a constant reminder of poverty and hopelessness. Real woolen clothing was extremely expensive and available only to very wealthy people or church dignitaries, but not to poor shepherds. Therefore, the poor were content with what they could take from fallen or slaughtered cattle, and sometimes from killed predators, which was a real success. In winter, these raw skins were instantly soaked by snow and rain, and then froze right on the body, turning into an icy, unyielding shell. This icy armor only made the hypothermia worse, pressing against the skin and drawing out the remaining heat. The cold from these skins penetrated to the very bones, causing excruciating aches and chills, turning every step into a test. The parasites that lived and multiplied in the uncultivated hides were a constant source of unbearable discomfort. Skin diseases, boils, lichens, and constant torment that undermined the shepherd's already weak health. Not surprisingly, many suffered from chronic skin infections that could lead to sepsis and death. The lack of a change of clothing meant that these shoes were the shepherd's only protection, and their condition only added to his suffering. Under the skins, the shepherd's skin was covered with constant combs, ulcers, and his hair was full of lice, which caused a constant, unbearable itch. My sleep was restless as the insects kept me busy. With the arrival of winter, food supplies were dwindling at a terrifying, uncontrollable rate. Shepherds lived in conditions of constant, debilitating hunger, which was not just an unpleasant sensation, but a chronic condition that sapped strength and will. Their diet was more than meager. They were on the verge of survival. This could be a small, moldy piece of bread, which they were given very rarely, or the remains of grain, which they could exchange with random travelers or during rare visits to the village. Each crumb was worth its weight in gold. However, the most terrible test for the shepherd was when his sheep began to die en masse from cold, disease, or hunger, which was not a common occurrence in winter. At such times, the shepherd had to make a truly diabolical decision. He was faced with a choice: eat the fallen animal to keep himself alive and not starve to death, or leave it for the pack of wolves that always hung around. Most often, they decided to cannibalize by eating the corpses of their sheep, despite the conscious risk of contracting deadly diseases such as anthrax or various carrion-borne infections, such as brucellosis, tuberculosis, or echinococcosis. It was a desperate act dictated by the instinct of self-preservation, and each such feast was associated with torments of conscience and fear. Hunger drove them to do the most terrible and disgusting things: dig up edible roots from under the deep snow, risking frostbite on their hands and falling into a hole, catch flies, voles, and small birds with their bare hands, search for carrion from wild animals that could be infected or decomposed, which increased the risk of contracting deadly diseases. Each such choice was an act of desperation, where the line between man and animal was blurred, and the instinct of survival prevailed over all moral principles. In addition to physical hardships, shepherds were constantly suffering from loneliness and isolation. Days and nights spent away from human society among endless fields and mountains led to mental disorders, depression, and hallucinations. Communication with people was rare and random, and often consisted of brief exchanges of information. The lack of any social support or comfort added to their suffering. Many shepherds died from disease, starvation, wild animal attacks, or accidents, and their bodies could remain undetected for a long time. For those few who lived to old age, life didn't get any easier. Worn out by disease, weakened by hunger and deprivation, They often became a burden to their communities and died in poverty and oblivion. Life as a shepherd was not just hard, it was a slow death, where every day was a struggle for survival, and every night was a test of strength. Their work required great physical endurance and moral fortitude. Shepherds were forced to move constantly, covering long distances on foot, often over rough terrain in any weather. They carried heavy equipment, including scant supplies of food, primitive tools, and weapons to protect them from predators. Sleepless nights spent guarding the herd were common, and short hours of sleep, often on the bare ground, did not bring much rest. Constant stress and danger led to chronic sleep deprivation, exhaustion, and increased irritability. Their way of life was extremely primitive. They did not have access to basic amenities such as clean water, soap, or warm food. The water was often dirty and contaminated, leading to intestinal infections and parasitic diseases. Lack of hygiene was compounded by the lack of opportunity to wash clothes or wash. Body odors, rotting clothing, and animal odors mixed, creating an unbearable stench that followed the shepherd everywhere. Despite all these difficulties, shepherds were an integral part of the agrarian society. They provided the people with meat, wool, and milk, playing a key role in the economy. Their work was undervalued, but without it, the survival of many communities would have been impossible. The shepherds were true heroes of their time, surviving in conditions that today seem unthinkable. Their stories are those of courage, perseverance, and boundless dedication to their cause, despite all the curses and hardships that have befallen them. Winter was a feast time for predators, and especially for wolves. With the onset of cold weather, when prey in the forest became scarce, flocks driven by hunger descended from the mountains, becoming the main threat to the shepherd herds. The wolves, with their keen senses and ruthless cunning, were able to penetrate even the most fortified pens, leaving a trail of blood and torn corpses in their wake. For the shepherds, this meant one thing: sleepless nights and constant tension. Their homes during the winter were primitive shelters, often no more than hastily constructed huts or even simple dugouts located on the edge of pastures. The interior was perpetually dark, lit only by the dim glow of a campfire. This bonfire was not just a source of warmth, it was the main line of defense, a symbol of human presence in a wild, hostile environment. Its crackling and flickering light cast moving shadows on the walls, creating an illusion of movement that could scare off predators, but at the same time played tricks on the shepherd's tired mind. The nights were a test of strength. Every rustle in the dark, every crack of a branch in the forest, every distant howl made one's heart skip a beat. Sleep was a luxury that only a lucky few enjoyed, and for most it was intermittent, full of worries and nightmares. During these hours, shepherds were alert, clutching their staff or primitive weapons, be it an axe or a sharpened stake. Their eyes, red from lack of sleep, peered out into the pitch blackness, trying to make out the flickering shadows or the gleam of a predator's eyes. Sometimes, despite all the precautions, the wolves still broke through. The attack was a moment of chaos and wild despair. The terrified sheep, their fur glowing in the moonlight, darted in panic, trying to avoid the sharp fangs. The shepherd, if he had time to act, rushed into battle. It wasn't just a fight for the herd, it was a fight for survival, for a livelihood, for life itself. The battles were fierce and merciless. Armed only with his bravery and primitive weapons, the shepherd came face to face with hungry, ferocious beasts. He might have been injured, maimed, or more often, killed defending his herd. His blood mixed with the snow became a silent witness to this eternal battle. Echoes of these fights were reflected in medieval legends and beliefs about werewolves. The stories of people turning into wolves and attacking lone travelers were not just a figment of fantasy, they were echoes of the real fear that shepherds felt before these ferocious predators. These myths served as both a warning and a way to make sense of the inexplicable and terrifying world around them. Wolves weren't just animals. They were the epitome of a wild, untamed nature that was always ready to devour human civilization. This constant threat brought up in the shepherds a special sharpness of perception, the ability to read the signs of nature and intuitively feel the approach of danger. Every sound of the wind, every movement of the bushes became a potential harbinger of trouble, keeping them in a state of eternal combat readiness. Winter in the Middle Ages was not just a cold season, it was a death trap, especially for those who, like shepherds, were forced to stay in the open air. One of the worst ways to die for a shepherd was to die of hypothermia. The cold seeped into his bones, draining his life force, slowly but surely leading to death. The clothing of shepherds, despite its roughness and density, could rarely provide adequate protection from the biting wind and icy air. They wore animal skins, coarse wool, and primitive cloaks that quickly got wet and lost their heat-insulating properties. Feet that were constantly in wet snow or mud were the first to freeze. Gloves and warm hats were rare, and so fingers, noses, and ears were constantly at risk of frostbite. If a shepherd fell ill, which was not uncommon due to the constant exposure to cold and damp, his fate was almost a foregone conclusion. The cold quickly turned to fever, and the fever to pneumonia. His weakness and exhaustion made him even more vulnerable to the elements. A shepherd who lost his strength could simply fall asleep from exhaustion on a frosty night, and this was equivalent to a death sentence. The body slowly cooled down, the metabolic processes slowed down, and death came quietly without agony, but inevitably. Getting lost in a blizzard was another common death scenario. Winter storms in the Middle Ages could be so severe that visibility dropped to zero. The wind whipped the snow against my face, blotting my eyes, making it almost impossible to navigate. Even experienced walkers who knew their terrain like the back of their hand could lose direction in such a storm. The lack of clear landmarks, snow-covered trails, and a monotonous white landscape led to the fact that a person began to walk in circles, getting deeper and deeper into snowdrifts and losing heat faster and faster. If he did not find shelter for several hours, death from hypothermia was inevitable. Frostbite was a common occurrence and a constant companion of winter shepherd life. Fingers and toes, noses, ears. All these parts of the body were the most vulnerable. At first they turned pale, then black, losing their sensitivity. If they were not followed by rapid amputation, which was almost impossible in the medieval wilderness, and the lack of medical care, gangrene set in, rotting the tissues, which then led to sepsis and inevitable death. Many shepherds were permanently disabled after such a winter, losing their limbs, crippled by the cold. Their bodies, exhausted and twisted, served as a living reminder of the harshness of nature. Every scar, every missing link in their mangled fingers was a silent survival story, or a miracle that allowed them to continue their existence. In the absence of basic hygiene, knowledge about the causes of diseases and affordable medicine, shepherds were extremely vulnerable to a wide variety of ailments. Their lives spent in constant contact with animals, in conditions of dampness, cold, and unsanitary conditions, created an ideal environment for the spread of infections. Not surprisingly, every winter brought with it a wave of diseases that claimed the lives of both the weak and the strong. Colds caused by constant exposure to cold and damp were commonplace. Often they turned into fevers, accompanied by high fever, delirium, and general exhaustion. Dysentery caused by drinking impure water or food quickly led to dehydration and fatal outcome. Pneumonia and inflammation of the lungs was especially insidious, as it often masqueraded as a common cold, but quickly progressed and made it impossible for a person to breathe. All these diseases, which seemed easy to treat today, were often fatal in the Middle Ages. The lack of antibiotics and even simple painkillers made every ailment a potentially fatal sentence. Any wound, from a branch cut to an animal bite or frostbite, was easily inflamed, since the shepherds did not have the slightest idea about antiseptics. The lack of clean bandages, disinfectants, and basic hygiene procedures led to the fact that the wounds rotted, and the infection quickly spread throughout the body, turning into sepsis, blood poisoning. Sepsis was a slow and painful death, accompanied by fever, chills, purulent foci all over the body, and gradual organ failure. For a shepherd far from any settlement, blood poisoning meant certain and terrible death, often in complete solitude. Treatment was limited to folk remedies and superstitions. Herbs such as psyllium or St. John's wort have been used to heal wounds or relieve inflammation, but their effectiveness has been extremely limited. Incantations and prayers were not so much a real cure as an attempt to find some hope and comfort in a hopeless situation. Shepherds believed that diseases were caused by evil spirits, corruption, or curses, and so they turned to medicine men and healers, who in turn used their own rituals and rites. They might have applied magic stones to the affected areas, fumigated them with smoke, or cast strange spells hoping that this would help banish the disease. If a shepherd fell ill, he was left alone with his illness, without help or hope. Often he was left to die alone, so that the disease would not spread to others, or because no one could or would help him in the wilderness. The isolation and lack of basic support made the suffering even more unbearable. The belief in evil spirits, curses, and witches was very strong and deeply ingrained in the mind of medieval man. Shepherds living far from civilization, in constant contact with the wild, were particularly susceptible to these superstitions. They believed that diseases were caused by witches, that bad luck in the herd was the result of an evil eye, and that wolves attacking sheep could be werewolves. To protect themselves from these invisible enemies, shepherds often resorted to amulets and amulets. These could be dried herbs, animal claws, oddly shaped stones, or even just sprigs of mountain ash tied to a staff. These items, in their opinion, had magical powers that could ward off evil spirits and protect against misfortune. In this atmosphere of fear and ignorance, superstition was not just a fad, it was part of everyday life, an attempt to understand and control a world that seemed incomprehensible and hostile to them. The lack of a rational explanation for what was happening forced them to turn to the mystical, to seek salvation where science is powerless. Their fear of unseen threats was as real as their fear of hungry wolves. The shepherd's life was unthinkably lonely, an isolation that seeped deep into the soul. For months or even years, these people were cut off from human society. Their only companions were their animals. Far away from villages and towns, without any connection to the outside world, they existed in their own separate world. Communication with the sheep, while comforting in some ways, was no substitute for human warmth and support. In the absence of any other intelligent interlocutor, shepherds often began to personify their charges, give them names, talk to them as if they were real friends, sharing their fears and rare moments of joy. In winter, this loneliness was aggravated to an unbearable extent. The boundless snow-covered scenery stretched all the way to the horizon, blending into the gray sky. No sign of life other than their own herd could be seen for miles. The world became a vast, silent desert, where every sound, if any, only served to emphasize the silence. The long hours in this silence and darkness, the constant stress of protecting the herd, and the hardships of hunger, cold, and lack of sleep were slowly but surely wearing Sihika down. The lack of changing impressions, the monotony of the environment, and the monotony of everyday tasks contributed to self-absorption, sometimes to a dangerous state. Constant stress and lack of social contacts led to serious mental disorders. Depression was a constant companion, manifesting itself in apathy, loss of interest in life, and a sense of hopelessness. Shepherds could spend hours looking at one point without reacting to the world around them. Hallucinations caused by exhaustion and lack of sensory stimulation were not uncommon. They could see shadows that weren't there, hear voices in the wind or the rustle of leaves, and talk to invisible people. The line between reality and fiction was blurring, and survival required not only physical but also great mental fortitude. Some of the shepherds were going crazy. Their minds, unable to withstand such a load, began to create their own reality. They could start talking to the sheep, seeing them as their companions, sharing their thoughts, fears, and hopes with them. To an outsider, this would look like madness, but to a shepherd, it was the only way to deal with the unbearable loneliness. Others wandered the fields, the snowy expanses, searching for long-dead relatives, their minds clinging to the ghosts of the past, trying to find some connection with the lost world. These wanderings often ended tragically, as the lost shepherd quickly became a victim of frost or predators. Their madness was the cry of a soul that was slowly being killed by isolation and unforgiving nature. Stories of crazed shepherds who saw ghosts or heard voices were common in medieval communities. These stories were passed down by word of mouth, gaining new details and becoming part of local folklore. They were a warning about the price that can be paid for such a life, and at the same time reflected the society's deep understanding of the invisible suffering that these people were going through. Sometimes local residents brought food or warm clothing, but most often the crazy shepherds were simply avoided, considering them either cursed or simply dangerous. Their madness was not only their personal tragedy, but also a symbol of how easily a person can be broken by the elements and isolation. These tragic fates served as a reminder of the fragility of the human mind in the face of an unforgiving nature. In the harsh conditions of a medieval winter, when temperatures dropped below freezing and snowstorms could last for weeks, the only source of heat for shepherds was a bonfire. It burned constantly in primitive shelter, dugouts cut into the slopes of hills, or in natural caves adapted for housing. These shelters were cramped and poorly ventilated, and the smoke from raw wood that had nowhere to go filled the entire space. It wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a smoky hell. The smoke was thick and acrid, enveloping everything inside the shelter. It penetrated the eyes, lungs, clothing, leaving behind a feeling of suffocation and incessant coughing. Raw wood gathered in a nearby forest burned poorly, releasing a huge amount of capote and tar. The shepherd's eyes were constantly watery, red, and inflamed. Chronic conjunctivitis was common, often leading to poor vision and even blindness later in life. Inhaling so much smoke day after day, month after month, destroyed the lungs. A chronic cough, often accompanied by expectoration of black phlegm, was an integral part of every shepherd's life. The airways became inflamed, making them extremely vulnerable to pneumonia, bronchitis, and other respiratory diseases that were deadly in those days. Each breath brought a new dose of caustic substances, slowly poisoning the body. The smoke settled on the mucous membranes, causing constant irritation and making them vulnerable to any infection. The constant lack of oxygen due to smoke also affected the general condition, leading to chronic fatigue and decreased immunity. The acrid smell of soot and smoke permeated the skin and hair of the shepherds. They were dirty and greasy, and they constantly gave off a heavy, unpleasant smell that did not fade even after a long stay in the fresh air. This dirt and soot penetrated the pores, causing irritation, rashes, and skin infections. My hands, constantly dry from the cold and soiled with soot, cracked, and dirt got into the cracks, aggravating the inflammation. The shepherds' faces were always covered with a layer of soot, which made them look haggard and old, regardless of their true age. But without fire, it would be even worse. A bonfire was the only way to keep from freezing to death. It provided minimal heat, allowing shepherds to survive in severe frosts. Next to him, you could at least warm your cold body a little, dry your sodden clothes, cook a meager meal. The smoke was the price of survival. This smoke wasn't just a nuisance. It was slowly killing them, destroying their health day by day, shortening their already short lives. It was a bargain with the devil, warmth in exchange for lungs, eyesight, and years of life. In this smoky hell, they spent most of their time, their bodies and spirits constantly exposed to this slow but inexorable poisoning that gradually turned them into shadows of themselves. Medieval shepherds, like many people of that time, were deeply superstitious, their lives completely dependent on the vagaries of nature and unpredictable fate, forced them to seek explanations and protection in a world they could not control. In the face of uncontrolled forces of nature, snowstorms, diseases, predators, they resorted to pagan rites and rituals to propitiate spirits, protect the herd from diseases and predators, or simply survive the winter. These rites were their last hope when all other means were exhausted. Their beliefs were a bizarre mixture of pre-Christian, pagan practices and superficially accepted Christianity. They believed that the world was inhabited by spirits, good and evil, who could both help and harm. To appease these spirits, the shepherds also offered small sacrifices to the earth. Some of their meager food, some wool from the sheep, or even a few drops of blood. They hung amulets made of animal bones, dried herbs, bird feathers, or oddly shaped stones on tree branches or corral fences. These items were believed to have magical powers that could ward off evil spirits and attract good luck. Spells and spells were an integral part of their daily lives. Shepherds recited them over their sheep to protect them from diseases or make them more fertile. They used them to appease predators so that they wouldn't attack their herd. Incantations were performed on sick animals or on wounded people in the hope of healing. These words, often meaningless from the point of view of logic, had a deep meaning for those who uttered them. They gave a sense of control over chaos, gave hope in hopelessness. They believed in the power of the words spoken with sincere faith, and this belief was reinforced by rare cases of recovery, which were attributed not to the natural course of the disease, but to their magical actions. Shepherds believed that a crop failure, a loss of livestock, or their own illness was the wrath of higher powers, a punishment for some transgression, or simply a manifestation of the evil will of spirits. So they tried to appease them in any way they could, even if it meant sacrificing everything they had. It could be the last egg, a single chicken, or even a part of their own body, such as a lock of hair or a drop of blood that they sacrificed. Their faith was deep and sincere, born of desperation and the constant threat of death. These magical rites were not just superstition, they were a psychological survival mechanism. They gave the shepherds the feeling that they weren't completely helpless in the face of fate. They created the illusion of control, allowing them to deal with enormous stress and uncertainty. In a world where there was no science, no medicine, no social protection, believing in magic was the only way to explain the inexplicable and find some support in the harsh reality. The lack of a rational explanation for what was happening forced them to turn to the mystical, to seek salvation where science is powerless. They lived in a world where every rustle in the forest, every change in the weather, could be a sign from above, and their rituals were their way of communicating with this invisible world. Death was postoyanum sputnicum, the shepherd's constant companion, an invisible shadow that followed him. It manifested itself not only in his own mortality, but also in the death of animals, sheep, lambs, which were his wards and source of livelihood. And of course, in the death of loved ones, those who remained somewhere far away, in the village, whose faces could be erased from memory for many years of loneliness. In winter, with its severe frosts, snowstorms, and lack of food, the death rate increased significantly. Every day was a challenge. Every step outside the shelter could be the last. For many shepherds, whose lives were a continuous series of hardships, cold, hunger, loneliness, and constant fear, death ceased to be a tragedy. It transformed into a release, a long-awaited peace from endless suffering. It was an acceptance of the inevitable, a deep acceptance of fate that had been shaped by years of grueling struggle to survive. They lived in one day without making plans for the future, because the very concept of the future seemed to them ephemeral and uncertain. Every breath, every heartbeat was a gift, and any trip to the woods for firewood or even just leaving the dugout in search of a lost sheep could be the last. They saw death in the eyes of freezing animals, felt its breath in the icy wind, felt its presence in every coughing fit. This grim reality profoundly shaped their worldview. Shepherds became fatalists who believed that their fate was preordained and it was impossible to change it. They did not complain about their sufferings, did not seek out the guilty, but simply accepted their fate with sullen stoicism. This philosophy helped them survive in inhumane conditions because it gave them a kind of inner peace. If everything is predetermined, then there is no point in fighting against the inevitable. But they were also incredibly resilient people. This resilience was not so much the result of optimism as of a stubborn refusal to give up. They continued to do their duty, to protect the herd, to seek food, to keep the fire burning, even when their bodies refused to obey and their minds were on the verge of insanity. They were doing things that would break most people. Their strength of spirit was forged in the crucible of constant danger and deprivation. Death was not only the end, but also a part of their life cycle. They saw their sheep freeze to death, wild animals attack their flocks, and their fellow craftsmen disappear into the snow. These images were imprinted in their memory, creating a kind of defense mechanism. When their own time came, for many it was not a fall into the abyss, but only a transition to another, perhaps less cruel world. There was no room in their minds for luxuries such as mourning or long goodbyes. Life was too short and harsh for such sentiments. The only thing that mattered was the continued existence of the herd, for which they sacrificed everything, including their lives. Their unmarked graves covered with snow, remains silent evidence of their struggle and final acceptance of fate. Even on the rare occasions when a shepherd reached old age and returned to the village, he rarely found a place in the familiar society. His eyes, accustomed to the vast expanse, seemed wild and distant, and his speech, which had not been practiced in conversation for a long time, was sparse and jerky. He bore the stamp of loneliness and all the suffering he had endured. The villagers treated such old people with respect, but also with some apprehension, seeing in them living relics of a bygone era whose souls were forever changed by the cruelty of winter pastures. Their quiet, sometimes insane wisdom was both a warning and a proof of the amazing endurance of the human spirit. They died most often quietly, unnoticed, in their modest homes, and their deaths were rarely accompanied by lavish ceremonies. It was another part of their lonely existence. Even on their last journey, they went quietly, disappearing into the same obscurity in which they lived. Their bodies, exhausted and broken, became part of the very wilderness. They had been fighting all their lives, closing the cycle of their harsh but self-sacrificing lives. The life of English shepherds in the Middle Ages in winter was a real test on the verge of human capabilities. It was a story about unthinkable hardships, constant struggle with nature, hunger, cold, and predators. Their survival was a miracle of resilience, ingenuity, and incredible stamina. They lived in conditions that seem unimaginable to us modern people, but they not only survived, but also preserved their culture, their knowledge, and their hope for the next season. Their experiences shaped not only their own destinies, but also the collective consciousness of the era, leaving a deep mark on folklore, songs, and customs. Each surviving shepherd was a living testament to what a person can do when faced with the merciless elements. They were inconspicuous heroes of their time, whose exploits went unsung, but whose role in maintaining agriculture, and therefore the survival of communities, was invaluable. We hope that this immersion in the dark realities of medieval winter has helped you to take a fresh look at the life of our ancestors. If you are moved by this story, if you want to learn more about how people survived in the harshest of times and discover other forgotten pages of history, subscribe to our channel. Here you will find new, exciting, and sometimes frightening stories about the past that will help you understand the present. Don't miss it. There are many more amazing things to come.